Donovan made a video for you guys on Tuesday talking about whether the Dolphins should make any moves at the trade deadline. Talk about players that we could acquire. Justin Simmons, that you guys saw on the thumbnail, a few other players, and you saw guys that we potentially move off from. We saw like Jeff Wilson, and there was definitely some movements that could be made theoretically on paper. This Dolphins team is certainly not a perfect team. There are holes around this team. I'm looking at offensive line. I'm looking at tight end. I'm talking about your second safety. Brandon Jones has been beat up and still hasn't quite come back to what he can be. Deshaun Elliott is very okay, but when you're on a team that has Super Bowl aspirations, okay is not okay. Good enough is not good enough. So both sides of the ball, multiple positions where you're like, okay, we can attack this. We can go spend, a middle round to late pick, go get a guy with an expiring contract on a team that isn't going anywhere, and try to go forward from there. And obviously, we saw the Dolphins didn't end up getting any players. They didn't end up moving any players. They just stayed completely still, as opposed to last year where we made that big trade to go get Bradley Chubb from the Broncos. There was multiple Broncos players that were on the market that potentially could have been moved. Were any of them moved, actually? I don't think a single Bronco ended up. Cortland Sutton stayed there. Jerry Jeudy, Justin Simmons, a few different guys that were the biggest one. What's his name? Corner on the Broncos. The kid. Patrick Surtain. Patrick Surtain was probably the one that was the guy that was most likely or most coveted amongst Dolphins players, and probably, well, not Dolphins players, but Dolphins fans. Donovan came out and said that, and I think we both talked about it, how we definitely see a move like Xavier Howard plus a pick for him, even though that feels like more of a Madden trade than a real life trade. Xavier Howard, really expensive contract, isn't getting any younger. Donovan, I remembered his name. Shut up. Well, I didn't remember his name. Google helped me out. That was a deal that could have potentially gotten done. It was more likely to have been just straight picks, or maybe a younger player. Maybe would have seen like Kader Kahoud, Nick Needham, a younger player on a cheap contract that can develop into a good player. But again, we didn't see any of that unfold. Just black and white for what it is. Yeah, it is a little disappointing to not see the Dolphins make the move. But then you kind of look at the logistics of it, and you look at just how good this team is. It probably was never going to happen. The Dolphins do not have a lot of cap space available. You expect... I just looked up Dolphins space, and there's a bunch of pictures of Dolphins in space. Dolphins cap space. I know it's not a lot right now. We're at $3.7 million, and they say salary cap's a myth, but it does matter. It is a real thing. You can't just go out and get guys and fingers crossed that you make it work. In theory, it's nice, but when it's not our money, you can't just say, oh, just fully guarantee everybody's contract for the rest of the season and open up infinite cap space. As much as that's nice to think about, that doesn't happen. So we went into the trade deadline knowing there's not a lot of money to be spent. There was some decent players out there. I never expected offensive linemen to be moved at the trade deadline, and I guess it was the perfect circumstance for that to happen. Minnesota Vikings, Kirk Cousins goes down, bring in Josh Dobbs, quarterback you don't really care for. You know he's not going to win you the Super Bowl. Maybe he can get you that 7th seed in the NFC, but the Jaguars come in and give you an offer for Ezra Cleveland. Cleveland, pretty solid offensive lineman, but for the Vikings standards, he's a pretty good offensive lineman. He's not I'm pretty sure he's a guard. He's not a top guard in the league. But the Jaguars were willing to give up adequate compensation, and we saw an offensive lineman move. That does not ever happen on trade deadline, because most bad teams, we're looking at the Carolina Panthers, we're looking at the Arizona Cardinals, teams that are not the Chicago Bears. All three of those teams, the first two, young quarterbacks they're trying to develop, or two of those two teams with quarterbacks they're trying to develop, in the Chicago Bears and the Carolina Panthers. The Carolina Panthers are not giving up anybody that is going to make it harder for Bryce Young to sit back in the pocket. And same thing with the Bears when Justin Fields eventually comes back. Even if they don't necessarily believe in Justin Fields, and they're kind of deciding whether he is the guy going forward, they're going to give him all the opportunities to succeed. And getting rid of an offensive lineman is not the way of doing that. And you look over with the Arizona Cardinals, who don't have a good offensive line regardless. and then you're getting Kyler Murray back. You want to see with this new coaching staff, how is he going to look? How is he going to play? And the way to get the best out of him, the way to figure out whether there's something there or just focus on Caleb Williams, you want him standing upright. So you're not going to get an offensive lineman in the trade deadline. So that was a surprise for it to happen in the first place. And then you look, there wasn't a lot of big moves to be made. It was a lot, like now, the Washington Commanders were the biggest sellers, obviously two of their edges, but they have they have an incredible defensive line in general. Got a second and a third for Sweat and Chase Young. But there just wasn't a lot out there, as well as the Dolphins don't have a lot of money to spend. And there's not truly a lot of holes on this team. There's places that you'd like to be better than they are, but they're either not really able to be fixed, offensive line, or they're not worth giving up the money, giving up the assets. We're looking at tight end, we're looking at safety. Those are positions that we can make it work with the guys that we have. We are 6-2 with the guys that we have, so don't really need to go and spend the picks. Don't really need to go out and spend the money. Keep the cap space where it's at. Maybe pick somebody off of waivers. There's some veterans we've seen, like Leonard Fournette. We've seen Julio Jones get signed. There's still guys that are out there that are not first option, but as the season rolls out, you see some of those like 35, 36, 37-year-olds like we saw the Ndamukong Suh the last few years just grab onto a team towards the end because their bodies can't quite hold up for a full 17-game schedule, but they can hold for about 10, 11 games as they push forward for the playoffs. It's disappointing not to get a player, but I definitely understand why the Dolphins didn't go out and make any moves during the trade deadline.